When I started my very first podcast, it was 2016. I was 22 years old, no audience, no credibility. There was no reason for anybody to listen to me. And that is exactly why I'm excited to make this video, because 9 years later, I can look back and actually point out the different things that came from the podcast that I wasn't able to recognize in the moment when it was happening. So if you're somebody who's looking to hear a realistic view of what can happen from a year of podcasting, I think you're going to enjoy this video. This is not going to be one of those I made 1 million downloads and I have a Lamborghini now type situation. I feel like there's plenty of those stories already out there on the internet. This one's going to be more of a deep dive on the meaningful things that I found in my journey at the time that I fully give credit to the medium of podcasting for. So real quick, I'll start with the background of where I was before I even started the podcast. I had been in the fitness industry for about 5 years at this point. So I started at 17 years old at the front desk. I'd become a trainer at 18, spin instructor, doing boot camps, all that stuff, right? I was working at 3 different gyms at the time, and I was also going to school for kinesiology. And the 3 different gyms that I was working at, one was a CrossFit gym, and the 2 others were like normal gyms, right? And so at some of them, I did classes. At some of them, I had personal training clients. I was kind of all over the place. Now, I wanted to start a gym because that's the only thing I could think of that would kind of get me to the next level. That's what I thought I had to do. And so there was an investor at my gym. He owned a private jet leasing company, right? And he was basically interested in my idea. He wanted to kind of be a part of a gym. And I think it was mainly because he wanted a personal place that he could work out at. But the reason I mention that is because this podcast was a result of me actually starting it to build up some reputation, build up some credibility, and show some proof of concept that I actually kind of knew what I was doing in this industry, right? He was already a member at one of the gyms and kind of, knew that about me, but I wanted to show that my reach could extend beyond just this area. And so originally the podcast was a way for me to, one, just obsessively learn about gym ownership, about remote coaching, because my whole point of starting a gym was so that in the end I could go back to coaching people online and have more credibility for doing so because I had a gym, right? So I read this book called Sick in the Head by Judd Apatow. He's a comedian, director, famous producer in Hollywood, right? He basically interviewed all of these comedians when he was like 17 years old and compiled it into a book. And all these people were willing to talk to him, and they revealed such treasures in their conversations about best practices and things to pay attention to. And it just felt like the exact thing that I wanted to do, but in the world of fitness. I wanted to talk to the world-class coaches, the world-class athletes, and I wanted to figure out what does it take to make a full-time living in this business, because that was my only concern at the time, was like making a full-time career out of fitness so I didn't look stupid in front of my family. Because coming from an Indian background, I wanted to prove that, hey, you can make something happen with fitness, right? This is a valuable career. And I loved it, right? So it was something I saw myself doing anyways. But one of the things that I was just attuned to at the time was, okay, I need to begin making media in some format. Now that you know that piece of the background, the next piece that's important to know is I was listening to podcasts all over the place, right? And I was taking notes about gym ownership and little things that people were sharing on these episodes, like, oh, and make sure to include this line in the lease and things like that. I would make sure to absorb all of this information. And then the first iteration of my podcast was basically me talking to a bunch of gym owners that were all in my area and even beyond the area. And many of them were actually nice enough to talk to me off air and share some things with me, like what would be helpful for me to know before starting a gym, right? And I was really just collecting data, being informed and taking this back to the investor. But what I realized was not everybody does that, right? Not everybody reaches out and is willing to have a conversation with competitors or, that alone I realized was kind of a bold move. And there was only one person out of like 5 gyms, right, that ended up being kind of like, skeptical or, wasn't really as nice to me, right? But guess what? Years later, when my podcast blew up, this was another famous athlete. He ended up following my stuff. And so it was kind of a funny full circle moment. But anyways, me asking all these gym owners questions off air was kind of the beginning of the podcast, right? And so it's August 2016. It's the beginning of the month. And I hop on the phone with Michael Cazayoux. He's the host of the Brute Strength podcast at the time, which was one of the biggest fitness podcasts after like Barbell Shrugged and stuff like that. He was generous enough to hop on the phone with me. And I basically was telling him, hey, I want to start a podcast. Here's what I'm thinking. And I basically was looking for validation, right? And he was nice enough to give that to me. He told me what I needed to hear, which was really, you should do it. You can do it, right? And that lit a fire in me because within the next 30 days, so before September actually hit, I had recorded 3 episodes with world-class coaches and athletes. So the first episode that I did was with a world-class coach in the weightlifting community named Daniel Camargo. The second episode that I did was with Adi Zucker or Adi Cazayoux, and she was actually Mike Cazayoux's wife. And the reason that I talked to her was because she had just grown a company called Working Against Gravity to an insane level. There were like 10,000 people on a wait list, and I had seen Adi before any of this happened, right? So I was really retracing the steps. I was asking Adi how she grew what she did, and then she led me to Travis Mash, who is another world-class powerlifting and weightlifting coach. And so he was the person who featured her blog on his site, and that was the thing that basically exploded her company, where all these famous athletes in the CrossFit and weightlifting world are now working with her and her coaches. So I was ultimately just gathering research from just talking to all these people, trying to figure out how they did it, and just being endlessly curious on how I could do maybe 5% of that. For context, I was very afraid, okay? So I was very afraid of asking questions, of expressing my opinion. And so something that I did, if you go back and listen to those early episodes, I would kind of always just ask questions. I was afraid to kind of express my opinion after they said something, right? I kind of was really nervous and would just rush through the questions. But over time, something that was really cool was, and this didn't take a whole year, this took like 7 weeks. So by the end of 7 episodes, there was a dramatic shift in how I was speaking, how I was feeling on, I was on camera, but it wasn't being like a video version. It was an audio only show, but there was a change in the filler words that I was using, the confidence that was maybe beginning to build. Fear was still there, right? But it was getting better. Each episode it was getting dramatically better than the one before. Now, the next thing that happens after these first 3 episodes, which is absolutely insane, is all these other famous athletes and coaches in my niche begin to basically say yes. And this taught me the most important lesson, which is it's easier to get people to say yes when a lot of them are already saying yes. And so what happened was I got the first weightlifting coach and I used him to get the second weightlifting coach, right? And this person, Adi, was connected to the weightlifting coach. And so if I was like, hey, I actually also interviewed Travis, who was kind of one of your early mentors, guess what? Adi was probably more likely to say yes. And now, like my 5th episode was with this Olympic gymnast, for example, right? And he was also tied into the functional fitness world as well. But he never would have said yes, likely, if I didn't have those first 3 people, right? Then within the first 10 episodes, I also had the fittest man on earth. So the CrossFit Games champion of that year actually came on my show. And he wouldn't have said yes probably if some of the other people that were on didn't say yes. So this already was exceeding my expectations, the types of people that were saying yes in the first 5 and 10 episodes. The next 10 episodes are probably the most important out of all of them, right? The reason for this is because the next signal that I started to get was people being interested in what I had to say. Okay, so remember, I grew up kind of in an area where it's not like I was kind of the weird one for doing this, right? People were kind of staring at me like, what is all that equipment? What are you doing? Who are you talking to? Are you making money doing this? I was very, very odd for putting so much effort into this. I vividly remember it. It was very odd to be doing any type of podcasting back then. And so what's crazy is the people that I admired, so like really famous coaches or other famous athletes at the time, they would actually begin to now comment on my Instagram posts, right? I used to release a photo instead of a clip every time an episode would drop. And I remember this one famous person comments and is like, hey, like something along the lines of, can I come on the pod? And this didn't just happen once, this happened multiple times. And it was with people that I respected, not just those pitches you get in your email where you're like, who is this, right? And there were people that I would have been nervous to reach out to, but here they were kind of being like, yo, when are you going to have me on? So that was another big level up. Like now I've created this thing where other people want to be a part of it. And again, I attribute this to the roster. So the names, the people that I got together in that niche, in that community, now made it so that people who were also there were feeling kind of FOMO, right? They wanted to be included. They wanted to be featured. They saw all these other coaches and athletes being featured. I want to be next to them. Now we are at episode 14. This is the biggest episode for me personally because I was such a big fan of the person I was talking to. His name is CJ Martin. He's the CEO of Invictus Fitness. I had read his ebook. He was a very famous guy and produced a lot of world-class, athletes. And so I was basically very enamored by the idea of having CJ on. And I remember to even go back and forth with him, there was like days and days of back and forth, right? And then we finally got something scheduled. And then finally, when I'm all excited to record this, he's on, California time. I'm over here in Philly. So it's super late here at night. And I'm like all set up, ready to go. And he was a no-show. And I was like, oh man, wow. All right. So then I remember following back up and being like, no, I'm going to make this happen, right? So we reschedule. This again takes like probably over a month or 2 months before we finally get around and get connected. It took me probably 3 to 5 follow-ups at least to make this happen. And I keep thinking, what if I didn't do that, right? Like it really could have changed the course of how things played out. Because when he finally talked to me, we had such a great conversation and it became the seed for the dream internship that I was going to get later on that year. So I made episode 14 happen, right? That was a pivotal one. The next one that was really important was episode 17. So episode 17 is when I had on Marcus Philly. And he was somebody who at the time, Marcus had about 49.5K followers on Instagram. And I had DM'd him and I was like, hey man, I love what you're doing with functional bodybuilding. This is awesome. Like I see that nobody has done a podcast with you yet. And there were some things on ESPN, right? Because he was a famous athlete and it's like, there were some of those fast, cool clips that are on ESPN, but nothing like where you get to know him, right? And you get to know about the training style. So it was like, I would love to do an episode with you. It was like a 2-3 sentence DM. And basically he was like, yeah, that sounds good. Shoot me an email and let's look into it, right? So I basically moved the pitch from the DMs to the email and he basically agreed to it, right? He was like, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do it. So then I'm thinking not much of it. Like this is going to be just kind of another episode, right? And when we finally connect, I have to say there was something like we were on the same wavelength, right? Like we looked very different, but our brains were connecting on a different level and we really hit it off. The conversation was amazing. I pulled some great things out of him, right? And that episode, okay, despite remember, by this point, I had on people that had 300, 400,000 followers on Instagram, these famous athletes, right? And they did not transfer over as much audience power into mine. as someone like Marcus did. Because when Marcus came on, overnight, I was able to get thousands and thousands of downloads to where 10,000 downloads on just that one episode was like, I couldn't believe that it was happening. It was crazy, right? Now, the reason for this was because I did a good job with the episode, and he felt excited enough that he wanted to share it. And I'll tell you a story about how I learned later on how he went about sharing it. Now, the reason that my episode got so many downloads was because I did such a good job conducting a great conversation. I did a good job of putting Marcus in a good light. He felt proud of that episode. And so what I found years later was, the garbage man that would come and like a bunch of other people that were his clients, he ended up sharing that episode with people who would ask him about like, what's functional bodybuilding? And, what is it? Like, how does it work? What's your training style like? He basically used this episode that we did as kind of like a calling card. He gave it to some of these people. It was like, you've been asking about it. Check this out. This will tell you everything that there is to know about functional bodybuilding. And so that was crazy, right? So I found that fact out years and years later by talking to one of his clients, and he revealed that to me about how he first found me and how Marcus showed him, an episode of mine and was like, dude, check this out. And so the next reason that this is really crazy, episode 17, is because Marcus is the person who would later on go on to give me my dream job as a remote fitness coach. But this relationship that I had formed with Marcus was definitely the strongest out of everybody that I was talking to. Like, we were aligned, we connected the most. I was doing now his first version of ATS, like when his program for functional bodybuilding first came out. And I internally knew this is going to be big. This is going to be huge. And I have already kind of marked my spot. I have the only episode with him as of now. And guess what? So he went on to come back on for a second episode 30 something, right? And then here's the game changer. So the third episode that we did was really kind of crazy. And I'll come back to that because I want to kind of go in order here. So all of these things are kind of happening. I'm still here in Philly. I'm still coaching. I'm still figuring out stuff, right? And my interest towards starting a gym is fading more and more because the success that I'm seeing with some of the online stuff is no overhead, right? And people are interested in this. Like, I was able to launch my first digital product and make my first dollar online. So that is another life-changing moment when you first meet a stranger with your stuff and they actually press buy on something that you've built, right? It was $47 only, but it was like, it felt like $1 million to me because it was like, dude, I cracked the code. I made this happen, So while all this is going on, in between kind of the times that I would be coaching at these gyms, I would go to the Starbucks and I worked there every single day for hours and hours. I would get refills all day and just, it was kind of like my office for free, right? So I remember sitting there just working on my stuff and somebody walks in and goes, Misbah Haque? And I was like kind of shocked, right? That somebody knew who I was. I was like, how do you know me? And I was like, oh yeah, what's up? And he basically goes, dude, like I listen to your podcast. This might be kind of weird, but like, I love your show, blah, blah, blah. And he was going on to talk about my show. And I was like, you have got to be shitting me right now. Like, this is a real life person who listens. I don't even know this person, which is why it's crazy, right? So there were tons of people that listened to my podcast that were gym members and people that were in my in-person network. And I really did appreciate that, right? But the people that I thought was even cooler, that was even more life-changing for me, was the strangers, because that was the real proof in the pudding. Like, does this stuff work across the country, across a few states where people don't know me and don't like me? Can I replicate that effect? And I was, so that was kind of cool. So that was my first experience kind of getting recognized in any fashion in person from my podcast. And I was not even, past 30 episodes yet. This is still in the 20 to 30 episode range. So that was game changing. The next wild thing that happened was I had the opportunity to talk to Gary Vee's trainer. So I reached out to him. His name was Mike Vacanti. And he was somebody that I really admired because he had made a career out of writing. A lot of his leads and success came from his blog. And I wanted his advice on my podcast and how to grow it and things like that. And he was nice enough to take the time to hop on the call with me. And one of the things that he said, there's two things he said that really changed my view on things. Number one was him saying, I don't know. So when I asked him about distribution and growth and all this kind of stuff, he admitted, he was like, you know what, man, like, I actually don't know. Like, I'm not that great at distribution myself. I'm good at making the main thing, the blog post, the YouTube video, but I'm terrible with the distribution aspect and putting clips out and doing all that. So I don't know. And the reason that was game changing for me was because in my mind, I was like, oh, this guy knows it all. Like, he's Gary Vee's trainer. He must know everything. And him taking the time to be like, I don't know, kind of just took him off the pedestal for me and went like, okay, cool. Like, you don't have to be perfect to make this work, right? You don't have to know it all. The next thing that he told me, which really encouraged me, was he complimented my consistency. So he was looking through, the first thing he was doing when he was scanning through my podcast episodes to look at like the work that I had done and to kind of analyze and give advice was like, I really like the consistency here. I like how every 7 days, if you did the math, like I had not missed an episode for a long, long time, right? And while he was doing that, when we're talking, it unlocked another thing that I still carry with me to this day, which is your podcast needs to pass the scroll test. So most people who are going to be encountering your show may not even actually listen to an episode, right? But what you want is for the feed itself to be impressive, whether it is with the guests that you had on, the amount of episodes that you've done, or the actual topics and titles that you cover. Because in that moment, I realized, oh, he's scrolling through all this to get a feel for the publishing dates, to see how many episodes I did, what kinds of things that I talk about. And someone has a pretty good picture after just scrolling through your stuff on what you might be about. So this really gives importance to titles and things like that, right? Make your show very scannable, even if somebody doesn't listen to the full thing. Because a lot of times, some of these bigger guests and people that you're inviting, they're going to do that same thing. They're not going to go listen to a full episode. They're just going to scroll through. Okay, cool. You're only at 47. All right. I only do episodes with people that have over 100, right? Some people are looking for that. Some people are looking to see how consistent you are, like Mike was. It's like, okay, do you do this once a month? Is this the first episode you're doing after 3 years? Like, if you show up consistently, that does put the scale in your favor when it comes to getting yeses. So that was a game-changing lesson that I kind of learned by accident from talking to Gary Vee's trainer. Okay, so now let's talk about where things really begin to change. So it is now about February or March of 2017, right? Remember, I started the podcast August, or technically September of 2016. Now, I was basically at the time where I was now looking for an internship. I'd already done one at this physical therapist office that was actually my physical therapist for this injury that I had. That was pretty awesome, but I was looking for something in California. I was looking to go beyond my area. I knew that I would not be able to maybe do this later on, but I was in a unique position in my life where I could do this. I could go for the summer. I could try to land a job and see what would happen. So my whole goal in my mind was like, how can I use my podcast and the network that I've built to find an internship? Yes, I'm sure I could have, sold more digital products or whatever else I was doing. But to me, what mattered more was kind of becoming a legit coach and making a full-time career out of fitness. And I saw this as a path to do that because I was so connected to like the top dogs now that it was like one of these people has to say yes. So I remember reaching out to CJ from Invictus and I was like, hey, like I'm looking to do an internship, blah, blah. I really would love to learn from you. I admire you, respect you, all this stuff. I'm willing to work for free. I don't need you to pay me, right? So that was also a big, bold thing because now it's going to be costing me a lot of money to do this internship. And I remember him saying, hey, we're not hiring right now. We just hired a bunch of people or whatever, but we do have an internship thing open. Happy to put you in touch with like management, right? So I do that interview. There was 3 of the managers there, passed it, crushed it. It went well, right? And basically they approved, and they were like, yeah, you're going to come do this internship. And so this to me now became like the highlight of my life and career. I was like, okay, now June 1st is when this internship begins. I'm going to be in San Diego, California. Like, it's my dream to have visited California, right? And so that was a big deal. I knew that my podcast would grow because I'm around all, like, Invictus was actually a hotspot for tons of athletes and coaches, and people were there that I had access to, that I did get to interview while I was there. So now it's about to be June 1st. I'm about to be at my internship in San Diego. The next thing that comes as a result of my podcast is now a job working for a podcast guest. His name was Jared Moon. He owned a thing called Garage Gym Athlete at the time. He was like a really big person with garage workouts and things like that, right? And I had actually discovered him through a podcast. And so I remember getting connected with him. He was a guest on mine. He was very kind and stuff. And I remember being like, hey, I'm going to go do this internship at Invictus. He obviously knew who that was and where that was. And I need a gig. I need some part-time work that I'm able to do. I'm happy to help with whatever, you have going on. So he was very generous. He gave me $25 an hour. I was working remotely, like he was in Texas or whatever at the time. I was doing all sorts of stuff where I got to see behind the scenes and how online business works. That was kind of one of my first exposures beyond just myself, where I'm getting to see some of this. And I'm getting to kind of do this work in the off hours when I'm not doing the internship. So it's kind of nice. I'm making some money, but it's not like a lot of money, right? But still, I'm extremely grateful because I'm like, dude, I just got a job from my podcast. I just got an internship from my podcast. And so now I'm like, I have 2.5 months exactly, right? 2.5 months to make something happen. Because if something doesn't happen by August 15th, I got to come back and live my life here in PA and figure out, what I'm going to do next. But in my mind, I kind of had this feeling of like, I need to get a job in these next 2.5 months, hopefully in California, because I wanted secretly to be like here, So before even leaving for the internship, in my mind, I wasn't telling everybody this because other people were like, oh, you're going to stay, you're not going to come back, blah, blah. But like in my mind, I was actually trying to stay. I was like, I want to get a job there, hopefully if things work out, but I didn't want to set myself up for disappointment by being like, yep, it's going to happen for sure, right? But in my mind, that was a very big goal and tight time clock that I had, exactly 2.5 months. So now I get to the internship, right? I'm actually having a great time meeting all of these people. Some of them I saw in books and I'm like, wow, you're my friend now, like it was crazy. Let me share a quick story with you of what happened while I was at Invictus. So there was this one member there who was always kind of scowling at me, right? It was like, you could tell she didn't like me, or there was I don't know what I did. It was kind of like I was always feeling a little bit on edge when I was around her, because it was like, I could see it and I could sense it. And I remember one day getting a Facebook message from her, and she was basically like, it was a long one too. She was like, hey, I'm really sorry that I judged you. Most people that come to this gym, like they're trying to be the next big athlete and are just coaching so they can be athletes or whatever. And like, she had this misconception about me, whatever. Then she said that I listened to your podcast episode with Travis was this gymnastics coach at Invictus, super friendly guy, loved him, right? She was his client, right? And so I was cool with him, right? And while I was there, I did a podcast episode with him, and it was really awesome. It was fun. It was also some of my first in-person shows that I was now doing while I was there, by the way. So she listened to the episode with Travis because he's her coach, right? And she was just interested, I guess. And through that episode, her mindset completely shifted around what she felt about me and how she thought about me. She used some words around like smart, intelligent, like just thought-provoking things that you may not have assumed or guessed right as soon as you saw me, or you may not have assumed on just the gym floor. But behind the microphone, the conversation that I was having with her coach was clearly impressive enough to her that it totally 360 degrees shifted how she approached me. Like, I'm telling you, when the conversations that we had, even the highs and stuff at the gym, was like the scowl was gone. She was totally connected to me without me having to talk to her. You could tell she had binged a bunch more of my episodes and was kind of a fan now, which was wild. Now, the whole time I'm thinking like, all right, I want to be able to get this job at Invictus, right? That's kind of what I had in my mind. And it maybe in the back of my mind, I was like, all right, this part-time job I'm doing for Jared, maybe that can turn into something if Invictus doesn't work out, right? And so I remember that was beginning to come together, was the managers, the people at Invictus, they were beginning to kind of like me. And I basically had the chance to, so obviously in my mind, I was hoping for a job with Invictus, right? But I also knew, well, if I take this, like my own brand's going down the toilet and like I'm all Invictus, right? I'm not gonna have any time to do all of these other things that I want to do. And so that was a big factor in my decision. And another thing that I forgot to mention, by the way, another big thing that happened as a result of the podcast journey, and this is before I left for the internship, I was talking to a certification company, right? A respected certification company in our space. And I was telling them my story. I was like, look, I know you guys do these certifications, like here's how I'm trying to apply it. I don't just want to open up a physical gym. Thought I wanted to do that, but that's not really what I want to do. I want to make this work online. Will this work for me? And I remember the person on the other end was so impressed that they were like, wait, you're just leaving all your life behind and going to California for this internship for free? Like and I was like, yeah, like this is what I want to make happen. This is how I'm doing it. And this is what I did to get there. And I remember her offering me a job at that certification company as a coach, doing the remote coaching gig that I wanted. She was like, hit me back up after you're done the certification. Like, we would love to consider you working with us if you're interested, right? So in my mind, I was like, well, that's very flattering, first of all. Like, being able to tell her about what I had done with my podcast and how I had used it to help get this internship. She obviously knew who CJ and Invictus was, so there's this big respect factor that was happening from that as well. And even though I wasn't going to take that job, it was still cool that I got offered. So now I've got these 3 opportunities floating around, right? Now, we're approaching July 4th weekend, okay? I don't have a ton of money, obviously. But what I remember doing was there was another launch happening for Marcus's program called Awaken Training Series. He now has so many different programs, but that was like the only program that he had at the time. Everything else was like custom coaching that you had to do. This program was exploding, by the way. Like, it was taking the fitness industry by storm, and I was getting to witness and kind of be a part of it, by proxy. So I said, hey man, I would love, let's do, like, I'm here on this side of the coast until August 15th. I would love to do an episode with you. And this would have been our 3rd episode where he came on the show. And all of his episodes that he's been on are like my top episodes, right? They're the most downloaded ever. And by this point, maybe Marcus has done like 1 or 2 other podcasts, but not really. I'm still kind of the exclusive, any podcast appearance he's done has been on my show so far. And now some other people are beginning to see like, whoa, Marcus is super interesting. He's doing pods. Let me get him on my show, right? So I buy this ticket to go meet Marcus in person to record this podcast. By the way, I'm not really fully prepared with all this gear that you see now that I have and know how to use. It's like I had a GoPro, I had my iPhone, I had 2 $60 USB mics, had my Zoom H6. And I remember when I got there, because I was in Southern California, he was in San Rafael. And so I took the flight there and I was like, man, I really hope, like, this is costing a lot of money. I hope something comes of this, right? And one of the things I offered to do, by the way, while I was there was help shoot some content, right? So shooting some content for a supplement company at the time. While he was training, I filmed a couple extra videos and just kind of was trying to add value and do something for him. That one day that we spent recording and talking, hanging out was so awesome, right? And again, I told you we connected in such a way, like from day one, that I knew something was different here, right? Where I just remember having the feeling like, hey man, I want to talk to you if you have some time tomorrow. Like, I would love to pick your brain on some things for Airborne Mind Show and where I'm thinking of taking it and all that kind of stuff, right? I wanted to kind of get some advice from him because I was making some big career decisions with the whole Invictus thing and whatnot at the time, right? So he says, of course, yeah, I'm happy. Like, let's connect tomorrow at 8. And it was Sunday morning, right? Super early in the morning. He had some time. He hops on the call with me, and I remember saying to him, dude, like, I don't know if you need a coach right now, but like what you're doing, I'm so aligned with it. All of your training philosophies are things I've been studying and have come across on my own and discovered with all these other people. Like, you're doing it perfectly, and I want to be a part of what you're doing in some way. And I remember kind of explaining to him before then, like, look, Invictus, I might be able to get a job there. Like, they seem to like me, but here's the impact it might have on the Airborne Mind Show. Like, I don't know if I'll be able to sustain that while I'm doing this. That's really important to me, blah, blah, blah. And then he goes on to be like, look, you know, if you're serious about this and you're serious about, like, I would love to entertain this idea, basically, I think you would be a great fit. And essentially begins to now open up the door for what that could look like. What would it look like? When would I start? And the most important thing that Marcus kind of empowered me with was being like, look, you know, because he was a professional athlete and he was coaching and all that stuff, right? He was like, look, you can do this in 20 hours. You can make this fit in 20 hours per week if you are really diligent, and you can allocate the other 20 hours to your podcast and whatever else you're doing, right? I just remember when he said that, that was so freeing to me, because it was like, whoa, you're cool with me working on my thing, and you see how it's valuable in general and how it's done some things for us and connected us together in the first place. And that was a stark difference between, you know, it was kind of like Invictus would have been the bigger corporate job and you know, gotten me some prestige in the short term, but like would have really, I had to sacrifice a lot of other things to be able to do that, versus working with Marcus and at Functional Bodybuilding was going to be me doing exactly what I wanted to be doing, me getting to be a part of a team where I was the 5th employee, right? So it's like massive, massive learning, because I have direct access to Marcus and, you know, loved every minute of it. Just loved soaking in all of the knowledge that I was getting access to. I couldn't believe it. So that conversation essentially sealed the deal. It was like, all right, let's keep talking. And basically it was July 3rd or 4th that weekend. I went back to San Diego. I'd finished my internship like in a month or a month and a half, right? So now I was actually getting paid to do some of the classes and things I was doing with gift cards and stuff like that. And so now I'm getting close to finishing my internship, but I'm still there, right? And basically towards the end of July, so by the end of July and as August is approaching, we had solidified that yes, I was going to move to San Rafael. I was going to work with Marcus at Functional Bodybuilding. And guess what? This was going to be happening on August 15th. So in my mind, this was the craziest full circle moment, because I was like, wow, so much has happened in my life, personally, professionally, in these 52 weeks. And it's only been 52 weeks. Like, last year at this exact time, August 15th of 2016, I was figuring out how to record. I was editing. I was doing all sorts of stuff just to get this together. And 1 year later, I now have had my dream internship. I've met some crazy cool people. My network has expanded, and I've got my dream job with Marcus at Functional Bodybuilding. There's 2 more things that happen in this 1 year period that I want to leave you with. The first one is when I moved up and began working with Marcus, the very first day at work, his one client was there getting weighed in on the scale and stuff, right? Big finance guy, super wealthy dude. And I was walking up the steps and he looks at me and goes, Misbah Haque from the Airborne Mind Show? And I thought he was screwing with me, because it's like, oh, like, are you mocking me? I don't know. I just wasn't so used to hearing that, right? Outside of that coffee shop experience. And this dude's face lit up. And keep in mind, like, he's in his 40s or something, right? And so I'm already like, wow, like this guy respects me. He's a fan. That's crazy. And that little interaction, that little moment, you could tell how that shifted a bit of a dynamic, right? Between like Marcus got to observe that happening. So imagine your boss and his client is there geeking out over your show, your thing, right? Even though he's the more famous person, that definitely gave me some credibility and some brownie points, to which years later when Marcus was, cutting down his coaching roster, I ended up taking over and working with that client. And he was super excited to do so because I was the host of this show that he listened to. So that was one. The next thing was how I got to work with this other professional athlete, and she chose me because I didn't know her and she wanted kind of somebody with a fresh start. And so after that interaction, the next thing that happens is I'm sitting there working on my laptop downstairs. Marcus is upstairs and he shoots me a text, right? And he basically says something along the lines of, hey, what do you think? You plus me equal podcast, but it's hosted on functional bodybuilding. And I was like, wow, like this was almost even crazier than all the things that happened so far, right? Getting the dream internship, getting the dream job. He wanted me to not only help him co-produce this show, but he wanted me to be the co-host. He wanted me to be the person that was there for every episode. There weren't going to be guests and things like that originally for the show. So think about how wild that is. I did 3 episodes with him that were received so well, that did good things for both of us, that clearly showed we had a good dynamic, we had good chemistry, to the point where he wanted his own show under his brand with me. And so that obviously showed me a couple things, right? There was value that I was bringing to the company that was not just coaching related. I was bringing in the skill set that I had acquired with podcasting and helping him basically build this out. This was like not even my primary job there, right? It was like a secondary, tertiary role that I was doing, and I was happy to do it, even if I wasn't getting paid anything. I knew that the exposure that I was getting, the credibility that I was getting, the brand association that was being built through that was going to be game changing. And it was, because guess what? That show, as I got to help grow it, I got to see the behind the scenes. How quickly is this growing compared to mine? What is working with his that, wasn't with mine? And throughout all this time, remember, his programs, his online digital programs are blowing up. Aside from the coaching aspect of the company, like the digital programs, there's thousands of people signing up for this stuff, right? And so a lot of those people are listening to the podcast now, because when there's a product launch, we're talking about it on the episode, right? And we're plugging people back to the program. So I went on to do over 9 seasons. I did about 120 episodes on the Look Good, Move Well podcast. And yeah, those 120 episodes definitely extend beyond that 1 year and the 52 weeks that I'm talking about. But there were so many good things that happened from that show, right? Getting to just see it be an acquisition channel, getting to see people trust me through it. Like they first discovered me on that podcast. And it's wild. 8-9 years later, people still remember me from that show. I'll hop on with somebody on a sales call or something, and like you find out that the very first time they encountered my stuff was on the Look Good, Move Well show. So I hope that shows you how mind-bending this 1 year, these 52 weeks were for me, because I had the general vision in mind. Like, I want to make a full-time career out of fitness. I want to make a lot of money doing it. I want, all the good stuff. And I was now doing that. Like, I was able to do that at functional bodybuilding. I had a team around me that I loved. I loved my boss. I loved the people that I work with. It was freaking amazing. And I couldn't believe that all of this came from speaking into the microphone. I like to trace back a lot of big things that happen to what is the domino effect? What is that first domino that fell and knocked down everything else? And in every instance, all the great things that happen in these 52 weeks, and even in the next 3 years after that, many of them were derived from my podcast and then what became to be the Look Good, Move Well podcast. So I hope this shows you the power of what podcasting can do in a short period of time, in just 52 weeks, if you're willing to be consistent. And I hope you can see that it's not just about the money, right? Because it's about the connections. It's about the people that you meet. That's what I realized. I think my takeaway was, yes, all the downloads were cool, the views, all that stuff is awesome, the reviews, but really at the end of the day, the people that you meet, the handful, the 5 people, the 25 people that you meet, those are the people that change your life, like really have a lasting impact on your life. And you never would have met them if it wasn't for the show. And so I remind myself that all the time. The important part of this is the conversations that are created from it. My podcast allowed me at that time to be a part of the conversation, to be a part of the community. And I was not the smartest coach out there. I was not the most jacked dude, right? There were plenty of other people that were more qualified to be a remote coach at such a prestigious company like Functional Bodybuilding. But it was because of my podcast and the thinking that it demonstrated and the depth of knowledge that it showcased over time that allowed me to have some of these advantages, which eventually paid off in other ways. And I hope a little bit of this makes sense now too, as to how my company Pod Mahal got started and why I'm so obsessed with podcasting in the first place, right? It's changed my life. It's changed my career, not just in the podcasting world, but when I was coaching fitness. I coached fitness for 10 full years. I loved every minute of it. And I was able to achieve the goal of making a full-time living out of fitness. And it would not have been possible without podcasting. It served as my resume in many of these scenarios to where my actual resume didn't even matter, right? This got me through doors that just would not have opened otherwise. So if you've been on the fence about starting a podcast or getting back to yours and growing it, I want this to be a reminder to you to keep going, because you really never know the one person that you meet, the one person that's listening, the one person that you talk to who holds the key to changing your life, changing the trajectory of your career. Because that's what Marcus did for me. The conversations, the lessons, just getting to be around a founder like him and getting to absorb things from just how he works, how he lives, how he does things day to day. It has had an impact on me that it's worth tens of thousands of dollars. I could not pay to get that same knowledge. I wouldn't have understood it the same. It was being there, being in those rooms, being with those people that allowed me to be who I am today. And I have to trace that back. How did I get into those rooms? I would not have been able to get there if it wasn't for the pod. And so if this was useful, make sure to drop a comment. I would love to hear from you, and check out the free tools and links in the description below. I think some of them will be useful for where you're at. I know it certainly is something I wish I had when I first started. So all that good stuff is in the description below. And I appreciate you taking the time and hanging out, and I'll talk to you soon.